In the ancient city of York, archaeologists have made an astonishing discovery. In what was once a Roman cemetery, they have unearthed over 30 skeletons. But there is something remarkably gruesome about this find. All these skeletons have had their heads cut off.
From day one, when the first decapitated burial appeared, I think I personally felt, we'd hit the jackpot, really. This was something not only important in a York context, but something which was going to be important nationally, even internationally.
Adding to the strangeness, their heads had been placed in odd positions, between their knees, in the middle of their body, or at their feet. Even stranger, one of them has been buried with large, heavy iron rings around his ankles. This find is unique. A shackled burial such as this has never been found anywhere in the Roman world. All the skeletons appear to be men aged between 20 and 40. Could this mean they were casualties of war? Is this the site of a mass execution? Or is this a strange and bloody burial rite? To answer these questions, Timewatch has brought together an expert team of scientists, archaeologists, and historians. Using the latest scientific techniques, they will go on a quest to explore just what happened to these decapitated men.
I think I can give you a good suggestion as to when this happened, why it happened, and even give you the names of 2 or 3 of the victims.
This is a story that will lead to the very heart of the Roman Empire. At its center, an aging emperor, a struggle for power between his ambitious sons, bloodthirsty revenge, and the horror of war. In a remote corner of the Roman Empire lay a distant land. Its northern mountains and forests sheltered a people the Romans called barbarians, a people they would never civilize. To protect their possessions in the south, the Romans built Hadrian's Wall. This was the limit of Roman civilization. To guard their way of life, the Romans founded a legionary fortress at a place they called Iberacum. Today, the city of York stands on the site of that once prosperous Roman city. For centuries, it has been an archaeological treasure trove. A stone's throw from the city centre, a new dig is underway. Tests reveal that under this patio lie human remains from a Roman cemetery. Early last year, just yards away from the present dig, archaeologists discovered the graves of 30 decapitated men.
There was an amazing moment. I remember standing with our site manager and we looked at the first decapitated burial. And he said to me, there's something strange about this one. And sure enough, there was. The skull had been taken off and put down by the feet, as I recall. Then we started finding other things which were rather unusual, like a skeleton with these great thick iron rings, shackles, if you will, around its ankles.
In one grave, there were 2 skeletons. Strangely, investigations revealed their heads had been swapped over. This skeleton had been placed face down in the grave, evidence of a superstitious burial custom.
There are all sorts of unusual things about this cemetery which have come to light not only during the excavation but also in the research that's taken place afterwards.
This is the largest find of decapitated burials ever discovered from the Roman world. In York's medieval Guildhall, the 30 decapitated men have been laid out for examination. Human bone specialists Katie Tucker and Charlotte Roberts are investigating the remains.
So what have you found on this one? Well, this one has got one very, very sharp, clean cut through the third cervical vertebrae.
It's an absolutely wonderful cut, isn't it?
It is, it's very nice, yeah.
A cut mark right across the vertebra there and across here, and they fit like a jigsaw puzzle together.
To help with the examination, the very latest microscope technology is being used. Its stunning three-dimensional images give new insight into how these men were decapitated.
So we're looking at here at one of the neck vertebrae, which has been cut through from the back. So you've got the cut mark going all the way down here. It's very straight, it's got smooth edges, it's polished. In fact, the edges of the cut mark are the same colour as the rest of the bone. And you can see even here detail of the weapon that caused the injury, the scratch marks from the weapon.
The microscope graphically shows that this man died from one decisive blow. It was a clean cut made with a very sharp sword or axe, cutting right through the third vertebrae of his neck. Who were these men, and why did they die such a gruesome death? Were these men victims of a savage Roman war? Could they be executed prisoners or slaves? Or are we witnessing a mysterious Roman burial rite, one that involved the removal of the dead person's head before burial? If so, why? And what does it mean?
The Romans were very superstitious and were very fearful of the dead. The dead were feared because they both polluted, and also there was a fear that they may come and haunt as well. So the Roman view of the dead was as something to keep at arm's length as far as possible, and to ensure, if at all possible, that people passed quickly and smoothly through to the other world, rather than linger around and potentially haunt the living.
One such way to ensure this was to decapitate the dead person. This was a practice that went back to pre-Roman times.
It seems a pretty gruesome rite to cut off the head of what is a relative, a father or a son or a wife. And there must have been a very clear benefit to somebody, either that person or to somebody else, for that rite to have been practiced. It seems to us really gory and unpleasant. But in Celtic thought, clearly, or in Roman thought, this was something which was going to bring about a very positive end effect.
In previous decapitations found in Britain, the heads were removed with great skill, revealing a knowledge of anatomy. But as yet, no evidence has ever been discovered for who carried out the task.
I mean, maybe it's the local butcher, rather than necessarily being common enough to be a person who would do that as a matter of course. Or perhaps it's like a midwife, where you're called upon to do this kind of particular service on special occasions when your services are required.
Yeah, I mean, there's potentially this one's probably got one.
This theory may not explain what happened to the 30 bodies from York. The scientists are discovering that not all the decapitations were carried out with surgical precision.
This individual is interesting because
This man's head has been hacked off by 11 cuts to his vertebrae and jaw.
see this cut's come in here. It's gone into the body, but not gone all the way through, and then it's kind of fractured off the bone here. And there's another cut at the bottom as well. Again, has come in from the front, has cut into the body and has stopped.
So you've got a mixture of cuts from the front, back and side on this person.
He has got a little slice taken out the front of his mandible.
Oh yeah. Should I have a look at that?
See there, it's just kind of caught the front of the mandible. It seems to have come in from this side.
Yes.
Interestingly as well, he seems to have cranial trauma.
This man has suffered a severe blow to the head.
But I think with the...
Around the hole in the skull are fractures radiating outwards, and it seems to be contemporary with his neck injuries.
What order do you think these things were happening in?
Well, obviously a very, very horrendous death. I wonder whether the head injury was the first thing to happen, and maybe that made him end up on the ground, and then they tried to hack his head off, try it from the front, maybe rolled him over and did it from the back as well and from the side, and eventually his head came off. But it would have taken quite some time to do that on the basis of the number of cut marks.
The violence inflicted on this man seems at odds with the surgical cuts of a burial rite. So what can have been happening in Roman Britain that led to the deaths of these men? Indeed, when did they die? Investigations of the pottery found in the graves at the site have led to a breakthrough. The pottery has been dated to the time of the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, who came to Britain in the early 3rd century.
You can be so precise because of Severus's visit to Britain, because we know that in 208, when Severus arrives in Britain, they started making pottery for the legion outside the fortress.
The arrival of the army in York stimulated the production of pottery in styles that have not been seen before.
These 3 vessels were all little drinking beakers. We can tell their date because of the general proportions. We've got this little sort of carination. It's beginning to be sharp instead of rounded. So this gives us a dating, and so it fits in chronologically with the other material for the whole site. But none of the burials have anything that you wouldn't assign to about the 2nd and 3rd decades of the 3rd century.
Dating the burials to the time of the Emperor Severus is of major importance. Severus would have a huge impact on the Roman world, and his rule led to one of the bloodiest conflicts in the history of Roman Britain.
I think I see him as very ambitious, very determined, tough, calm, able to turn his hand to war, to law, to building, to peacemaking. Flexible, tough. Killed lots of people.
When Severus made his bid for power, the empire was fragmented and weakened by civil war. Backed by a powerful army, he swept aside all opposition and soon found himself at the gates of Rome.
One obvious reason why he won was he moved like the wind. The moment he knew that Rome was up for grabs, he marched on Rome. His rivals hung back. Rome is the fantastic city. If you've got Rome, then you can move outwards from it. And I think once he's marched on Rome, established power there, he's got the right pieces in place.
After years of conflict, Severus brought stability and confidence to the empire. This great arch in the heart of ancient Rome was built to celebrate his victories in the East.
This arch is about Septimius establishing himself in a great series of emperors. He's been in power for a decade now, and he's achieved the dream of every Roman emperor, or at least this is how he projects it, conquering Parthia. After Parthia, the only one left is Britain.
In 208 AD, Severus travelled to Hadrian's Wall, the empire's remotest frontier. Here, he turned his legions on the warring barbarian tribes of northern Britain. Severus made the legionary fortress of York his HQ. Wherever the emperor went, so did his government. For 3 years, York was the center of the Roman Empire. But at the age of 62, Severus, one of Rome's most ambitious emperors, had become infirm. It is thought he suffered with gout or acute arthritis. His legs and feet needed daily attention and massage from his doctors. Always at his side was his wife, Julia Domina, from a wealthy Syrian family. Also in the party was the family tutor, Euodus. But he was more than a mere school teacher. He was a key player in imperial politics. Wherever the emperor went, he took his most trusted official, Castor, his chamberlain, the man who controlled entrance to the emperor's private apartments. But on this campaign, he brought his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. The eldest son, like his father had been, was ruthless and impatient for power. By the age of 20, with the help of his tutor Euodus, he had murdered his father-in-law. Now he turned his malice on his younger brother Geta, who was his rival for the imperial throne. The Roman invasion of Scotland was violent and bloody. Could these skulls belong to men killed during Severus's war in Scotland? If so, are they Roman soldiers, or could they be Caledonian prisoners of war?
He's actually got rather good teeth, a very pronounced chin as well.
The answer lies in the dead person's teeth.
Robust, extreme.
It is, yeah.
Scientist Janet Montgomery will carry out a series of tests on 6 of the burials.
These are fine, plenty of enamel on there.
Hopefully, this will reveal their places of origin. In her lab, Janet and her colleagues are preparing the teeth for analysis. She is going to measure the levels of lead, strontium, and oxygen trapped in the enamel of the person's tooth.
They all go in there when the enamel is forming, which is during childhood, and then they stay there. The enamel doesn't change. It's a very robust tissue, and it doesn't turn over, it doesn't change. So once it's there for life. So it's like a little archive, a little snapshot of childhood that people carry around with them wherever they go.
The tooth enamel is dissolved, then small samples evaporated in preparation for scanning in an electron spectrometer. The data released is packed with information about climate, how warm or cold it was. It can also tell us about altitude and how far from the equator they were living. The whole process takes several weeks, but the results are stunning.
The data suggests we have a very cosmopolitan mix of people. We have people that could have come from Northern Europe, Northwest Europe. We have people from the Mediterranean region, and it's quite possible that there are people there from Africa as well.
The results are a key breakthrough in the search to identify these men. It suggests they could be men from Severus's army, which he drew from Africa and the conquered tribes of Germany and Britain. Could these be the bodies of men who fell in battle, fighting for Rome? Their injuries are revealing. This man suffered a deep blade cut to his right knee. The slashing sword would have brought him down, making decapitation that much easier.
So we can see the cut mark on this femur, the thigh bone around the knee joint, extending up here. Maybe you're seeing some flattening on here, and it's much easier to see those details in this image rather than just looking at the bone itself.
It seems as if a pattern is beginning to emerge. Some of the men are being struck and knocked to the ground before decapitation. Katie thinks this man has been stabbed in the groin.
Nice clean cut, straight across there.
This man was struck by a savage blow to the jaw.
Very, very straight cut, sharp edge.
Did these men fall in pursuit of an ever-expanding Roman Empire? When they died, York was going through a transformation. By 208, the legionary fortress covered an area of 50 acres and would have housed a garrison of 5,000 men. The old wooden fortifications were being replaced with stone. The medieval walls we can see today are built directly on the foundations of the Roman walls. The 14th century York Minster stands on what was once the very heart of the Roman fortress. Here, over 1,000 years earlier, the Romans built a great basilica. Down in the crypt, 4 meters below today's ground level, there are some important clues as to what this building looked like.
Well, this is a really fantastic discovery. This is a Roman column, exactly where it was put in the late 1st century AD. It's made of millstone grit, a good Yorkshire building stone, and it's one of 16 which originally stood in the great hall of the basilica in the Roman fortress. There were 8 on either side of the central space, the central nave, which was something like 40 feet wide. So that gives you an impression of the size of this building. This is a truly splendid, magnificent structure. The whole thing was about 230 feet long, maybe stood about 80 feet high in all. And so when the Emperor Septimius Severus arrived, he would have found a building as good as anything in the Roman world, really, a great military building of a standard which he would have been familiar with in other parts of the Roman world.
As York transformed, so did its population. Merchants and soldiers flooded in here from every corner of the empire. And clues to their diversity can be found in the gods they left behind.
Well, in the case, you have a real assortment of figurines and evidence of the different religions and cults that were practiced and worshipped by the people who lived in Roman York. And they vary enormously from quite official religions. For instance, we have Mercury over here, and the cockerels associated with Mercury. An official god, one of the most widely venerated gods throughout the whole of the Roman Empire. If you go from Mercury and his little cockerels to perhaps the most exotic we have in York, which is the Apis bull. So we have official Latin gods all the way through to Greco-Egyptian gods that Severus would have been quite familiar with, being growing up in North Africa. This tells us that the people who lived in Roman York weren't really what you'd perhaps think of as a Roman. You know, there's very few that ever came from Rome. They came from all over the empire.
For 3 years, Severus waged war on the tribes of Scotland. His campaign was a huge logistical operation, building marching forts and supply bases to feed the thousands of troops involved. Severus's reasons for the invasion of Scotland are complex. Why would an aging emperor suffering from gout want to endure the hardships of war?
There's no point at which you can get off the bus called victory, because on that relies your credibility. By defeating some Scots, you show that you can still defeat any of your rivals or any of the other threats to the empire.
A victory for Severus would help to ensure the succession of his sons to the imperial throne. And to this end, he made them joint emperors. Geta spent his time on administrative duties concerning the governing of Britain and learning the role of emperor. But Caracalla had no intention of sharing the imperial throne. Impatient to succeed his father as sole emperor, he preferred the company of his men when on campaign. The Romans had major problems in Scotland. They found the terrain harsh and unforgiving. They were strangers in a mountain wilderness of lochs and bogs, a land of dangerous, fast-flowing rivers and impenetrable forests. According to Roman historians, the natives inhabited deserted, marshy plains. They have no walls, no cities, and no agriculture, but live off their flocks and from hunting. When Severus went on campaign, he was so unwell he had to be carried. He pursued the Caledonian tribes without any decisive victory. As he pushed deeper into the highlands, the enemy just seemed to melt away. But whenever the Romans found a settlement, nobody was spared. Severus ordered his men to show no mercy. Let no one escape utter destruction. Let no one escape our hands, not even the babe in its mother's womb. The Romans pursued a campaign of scorched earth, driving people from their homes, stealing and laying waste their lands. Severus's strategy was to terrorize the Caledonians so they would beg for peace. But the Romans didn't have it all their own way. The big problem was getting the enemy to come to battle. The Caledonians had more sense than to risk a pitched battle with lines of armored legionaries. Severus's men found themselves fighting a guerrilla war. Wounded soldiers would be killed by their own men, rather than be left to fall into the hands of the barbarians. The Highlanders, familiar with the terrain, ambushed and harassed the legions. Caledonian warriors would pick off Romans that had strayed into their forests. The Roman sources have suggested that Severus lost a staggering 50,000 men in his 3 years of campaigning in Scotland. The evidence of violent deaths, the clues from the pottery and dead men's teeth suggest they fell fighting in the legions. But there is one burial that continues to perplex. This man has been buried with heavy iron shackles around his ankles. The results of the teeth analysis reveal this individual comes from the Mediterranean, not a slave from Britain, as might be imagined. So why, of all the burials, has he suffered this humiliating punishment?
Probably the most interesting thing going on is actually to his lower legs, especially to this side. There's this very localised area of kind of expansion of the shaft, which is probably a leg ulcer or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's very localised, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I noticed there's a fracture here.
Yeah, there is, yeah, a fracture of the fibula.
Which seems to be quite long-standing. It's been there for quite some time. And I suppose a lot of people would ask the question, well, is that fracture associated with having the shackle maybe applied to the leg?
Right, yeah.
When this person was living, I think that the leg would have been really swollen, really red and hot and painful.
Yeah.
Under the microscope, The damage done by the shackles is clearly evident.
You can see that you've got
The leg bone has been left deeply pitted and scarred.
in the bone formation.
I think this person would have had a lot of pain in this leg particularly as a result of having the shackles on, and would have had difficulty moving around.
What we have here are 2 iron rings which were found around the ankles of the skeleton, and I haven't ever come across anything like this before. So I think what we've got here is an example of some very unusual and, one might say, very cruel punishment of this individual to have had this done to him while still alive. And we've just had these things x-rayed to give us a bit more detail about what they look like. And we can see here, this is the larger one here, and we can see the weld point there where the two, as it were, the 2 halves have been welded together. And you can see it on the other one there, also very clear. There are slave shackles known from the Roman world which have a chain between them, the idea being to stop a man running away, basically. And I expected to find a chain which would go between these 2. Now, when we look on the x-ray, there is absolutely no trace of that. So it looks as though they are something rather different here, that the main purpose of them is actually to weigh him down, if you like. It conjures up an awful picture, actually, of the man, as it were, being held down while the smith comes in. You would have an open wound as a result of putting the things on in the first place, and then the things chafe and cause further inflammation. So by the time the poor fellow, finally passed on, he would have been in considerable pain, I would have thought, yeah.
Could the humiliating treatment meted out to this man mean he transgressed an important military code? Discipline was severe in the Roman army, and charges of cowardice often ended in death.
I think these people could very much have been the victims of warfare. They're young, they're male, they're the right kind of fighting age for warriors. And it suggests to me that there's either some particular ritual going on here, or it may be an act of disgrace. There is a tradition in the Roman army that if you're a coward, or perhaps a whole unit shows cowardice, then every 10th man is killed in front of their fellows as a kind of deterrent, a huge punishment. And they may well have been then, their bodies may have been treated in a humiliating way, and it was an act of ultimate disgrace and ultimate humiliation.
At the new dig in York, even more human remains are beginning to appear. But the strangeness of these burials continues to shock and mystify the archaeologists.
Well, I'm looking here at what seems to be a very unusual burial, with the skull sitting on its own there, and then in this area, remains of the rest of the body. In this grave, we've got a decapitated skeleton. It looks as though the skull's been put down there between the right arm and the left leg. It's a very curious body position. So we've got a burial here which has been really badly treated. The body treated with very little of the sort of conventional respect that one expects. It really is quite extraordinary.
The disrespect shown to these new skeletons suggests this is not a burial rite. These men were not decapitated by their loved ones to help speed them on to the afterlife. But what has emerged is that all the skeletons were buried in a very prominent and important position in this once huge Roman cemetery. It's an area called the Mount.
The interesting thing about the Mount area is that there are a lot of high status burials there as well. It's up on a high point, it's high ground, overlooking the main Roman road from the southwest as it approaches York, and then as it continues down into the town itself. So this is, we think, is a privileged place of burial. And that's what makes these decapitated burials rather difficult to understand.
If this part of the cemetery was for the wealthy Romans of York, then the men buried here would not have been slaves or prisoners. So who are they, and what happened? After intense investigation, What conclusions have the human bone experts reached?
I think that the injuries that I've seen on the neck vertebrae and elsewhere on the body suggests that they are perimortem injuries. Around the time of death, these injuries occurred.
So could these men have been decapitated in battle?
There are no, for example, defence injuries on the hands or the forearms. There are no perimortem injuries to the rib cage. There are no perimortem injuries to the facial area of the skulls. So really what we're seeing are perimortem injuries just to the areas of the body that are relevant for decapitation.
But some of the skeletons show signs of violence to the legs and skulls.
Yeah, I suspect on the basis of a few of the individuals that somebody tried to injure them first to try and maybe get them on the ground so they could be decapitated. So they may be trying to run away because they knew what was coming, but then they were injured and they fell to the ground, and then that gave the person who was decapitating them the chance to do the deed. I would think for many of the individuals it was a pretty traumatic event for them. In some of the individuals have got multiple cut marks on the neck vertebrae and elsewhere around the skull area, suggesting these people were rather hacked around to get the head off. In my professional opinion, these people were executed by decapitation.
If the injuries inflicted on these men have nothing to do with warfare, then this suggests quite a different kind of struggle took place. The struggle for power. Anthony Burley is a leading historian who has researched extensively the life of Severus and his war in Scotland. He has a theory to explain the deaths in York based on the writings of the Roman historian Cassius Dio.
If Patrick Otway and his team tell us that these skeletons belong to the early 3rd century and that more than 24 of them were executed, decapitated, I think I can give you a good suggestion as to when this happened, why it happened, and even give you the names of 2 or 3 of the victims.
Antony's theory begins with Cassius Dio's account on the end of Severus's war in Scotland. Caracalla's wild ambition and the black passions of his soul drove him to draw his dagger and make a lunge at the emperor. Severus, knowing he was close to death, spared his son's life. According to Dio, the war had taken its toll on the emperor. Severus was suffering badly and could hardly walk. He needed constant treatment from his doctors. Like all Romans, Severus was superstitious. He'd learnt from the stars he would not see Rome again. Knowing his father was close to death only seemed to increase Caracalla's frustrations. He tried on several occasions to enter the emperor's bedchamber. He wanted the doctors to hasten his father's end, but they refused. In 211 AD, after a long illness, the Emperor Septimius Severus died in York. His 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, became joint rulers of the Roman Empire. Severus's body was burnt on a huge pyre, the like of which had never been seen in Britain. But before the embers had cooled, Caracalla had begun a bloody bid for sole power.
Well, the first thing he does is kill off the people who had opposed him while his father was still alive. The Chamberlain and Secretary for Imperial Memory, Castor, who had obviously obstructed him gaining access to Severus before. The old tutor, Euodus, who is probably murdered because he wanted Caracalla and Geta to be friends, as they had been when they were very little boys, when he was first in charge of them. In spite of the fact that he'd been the one who helped Caracalla to kill his father-in-law. And the doctors, who had refused Caracalla's request or order to hasten his father's death. As soon as his father finally does die, that's it for the doctors.
Geta and his mother had returned to Rome as Caracalla brutally consolidated his authority.
I think you do get ruthless emperors who are trying to make their mark by stamping out all opposition. And one of the things that is very common in the Roman imperial accession is something called damnatio, which is a way of publicly and ritually and ceremonially getting rid of the people around you so that you are in overall power and overall charge. Now, it may be your family, it may be the people who perhaps opposed you and challenged your authority, but it's something which means that you start with a clean slate, you have your own supporters whom you choose, and you get rid of all the opposition so that there can't be any insurgency or any opposition after you've acceded to the throne.
Now we know who these men are and why they died. But what happened on the day of their execution?
But it would be a public spectacle. To warn other people in the imperial entourage, this is what you'll get if you don't do as I say.
The situation would have been extremely theatrical. The idea would have been a kind of performance where maybe the entire community was there to see this happen. It would have been very bloody. The sound and smell would have been very important as well. So the whole thing is a piece of theatre, maybe designed as a massive deterrent to other people.
More than 30 men are known to have died in Caracalla's personally supervised damnation. The strange positioning of their heads, a dishonor meted out to them even after death. Their bones, testament to Caracalla's bloodlust. In Rome, Caracalla and Geta tried to rule as joint emperors, but their rivalry made it impossible for these two men to share power.
How can two brothers inherit imperial power? Only when a royal system has no power can brothers survive alongside each other. But in serious empires, you have to kill your rivals.
Caracalla was obsessed with becoming sole emperor. In the imperial palace, he confronted Gita.
Caracalla didn't want to live with Gita. He'd have had to juggle just too much, make too many compromises. He wanted unified power in one person. I think he was almost bound to kill him.
Gita died in his mother's arms. Had she shown any doubt in her loyalty to the new emperor, she too would have died. Caracalla went on to consolidate his power, but at a cost of 20,000 murders. In an attempt to erase any evidence that Gita ever existed, Caracalla removed his brother's name from every monument in the empire. From the great arch of Severus in the Forum to this small arch in a back street of Rome. It was called Damnatio Memoriae, damnation of memory.
This charming little arch is a sort of mini version of the big one in the Forum. And inside, these absolutely lovely portraits of the family. There's Septimius himself, standing with his beard by an altar sacrificing. Beside him, his wife, Julia Domna. And then on the other side, another figure, young and handsome, sacrificing at an altar. And beside him, blank. No prizes for guessing who's missing. You read the inscription, and you find that the name of Caracalla has got even longer than it should be. And there's a lot of stuff about fortissimus felicissimusque. He's the bravest and luckiest of princes. And it's written over the name of his little brother Gita. That deletion, plus the deletion of the image, is the perfect example of what damnatio memoriae means. The memory is wiped.
Caracalla's reign as emperor lasted 5 years. But his luck ran out while stopping to relieve himself during a campaign. He was murdered by one of his commanders who'd found his name on a death list drawn up by Caracalla. In York, the last decapitated bodies are being exhumed. Silent witnesses to the barbarity of a bygone age. Their murderer's own death sparked yet another long and bloody power struggle. Yet another chapter in the history of the greatest empire to rule the ancient world. The glory that was Rome.